So here we are. I find it hard to think that it's over a year now since I've been talking to a screen on and off. Last year I did a series on recognising Jesus in the new normal. This time David Sandberg has arranged a series talking about the servant king, the risen king, the foretold king, the shepherd king, and I've been drawn into this to speak on the foretold king, which is something that I don't know very much about. But before we start, a health warning: servant king, risen king, foretold king, shepherd king. It's very easy for us to concentrate on the verb rather than the noun, on the quality rather than the essence of who Jesus is. You know, we talk about the King of Rock, we talk about king-size mattress, we talk about Burger King, but Jesus is a king. And when we say that, we mean that he's got a kingdom, that a kingdom has laws, and there's a people, and there's a land, a territory, an area that is under the rule of the king, and by implication, an area that's not. The kingdom is always people governed by a king. Now, that's just for starters. That's just making the obvious obvious. And so I'm talking about the foretold king, the king whose coming and life, death, eventual purposes were all predicted. And I've been asked to start from the road to Emmaus story. We know the story, we've talked about it a lot of times, about the grieving disciples. One of my favourite parts of the Easter story. Jesus turns up and explains the scriptures to them. They fail to recognise him even over a couple of hours talking to him until something amazing happens. When they start to eat supper, they recognise who he is and he disappears from their sight. So the conversation starts off when the stranger comes up to them and at the end of their turn of talking, they say, but we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. Redeeming Israel was what all Jews were concerned about. These guys had a view about the political situation. They wanted to get rid of the Romans. They wanted to get rid of the Jewish collaborators. And they expected that Jesus would lead them to war. And after they'd done all this, when they got to that particular point, Jesus responded to them and he said, how foolish you are, how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Prophets do predicting, don't they? Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in the scripture concerning himself. The Jews saw the Old Testament as full of references to the Messiah. Christians see at least as many. We call them messianic prophecies. Some people see a lot more messianic prophecies, messianic predictions than others. But I was brought up believing that from the Garden of Eden onwards, there were over 300 references to the coming of Christ. But if we concentrate on just the predictions that are quoted in the New Testament, that's the safe thing to do. There are a whole lot, and some of them are quite surprising. There's a prediction that Jesus would spend some of his life in Nazareth. That's mentioned once in the New Testament. It's mentioned that he would come on a donkey. And in fact, apparently the rabbis used to say that if the Jewish people were righteous and obedient, the Messiah would come in the clouds, and that if they weren't, he would come on a donkey. Twice it's mentioned that it was predicted that he would be born in Bethlehem. 3 times, I didn't realise this, 3 times they mentioned that somebody would be paid 30 silver coins to betray him. 3 times it's mentioned that the scriptures predicted, this is the one in Genesis, that he will be born to a woman. 4 times it's mentioned that he would be the rejected cornerstone. And when you get to the suffering servant account, the Isaiah 53 passage, where it talks about the way in which Jesus would die, 12 times in the New Testament that is mentioned. So it's hardly surprising that Jesus had gone through this stuff with the disciples over the 3 years that he'd spent with them, and it took a couple of hours to go through all of it, and they still weren't getting it. They were suffering from the problem of confirmation bias. It's one of our cognitive biases that goes on in our mind. We have the ability to go through a lot of stuff, what we see, what we hear, but we only hear the things that confirm what we already think. We hear somebody talking and say, oh yeah, they're saying the same thing as me. Just because we're focused on picking the bits out of it that fit in with what we think. That's why Jesus says to them, how foolish you are, how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Bit harsh, wasn't he? How foolish, how slow. Just like the young guy who looks at two cars. There's a reliable car, but then there's a boy racer car, and the one may have low mileage and have been well treated by an elderly lady and looked after and kept in a garage. The other one has got bald tyres, it's got bits falling off, it's got a stratospheric mileage, has probably been clocked a couple of times, but he can only see the fact that he's going to look good in it, that it fits with his expectations. So it's not surprising that Eugene Peterson in The Message translates it this way. How foolish you are and how slow to believe. He says, thick heads, slow hearts. It is a bit harsh, but Jesus always treated unbelief as willful. He was never sympathetic to people who didn't believe. He was unfailingly blunt about it. Of course, behaving matters, but in fact, the behaving's never quite right unless there's belief about it. They'd been brought up on predictions of the Messiah, but only engaged the bits that fitted with their hopes and with their politics, just like those of us who read a particular newspaper and have our biases all confirmed. This thing about unbelief is not just seen with Jesus, although it's seen right the way through the Gospels. Paul picked it up. He said, you foolish Galatians, did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law or by believing what you heard? If you don't believe, you're foolish. It repeats himself. Are you so foolish? Does God give you his Spirit and work miracles among you by the works of the law or by believing what you've heard? Let me just talk a bit, do a little bit of promotion about how we're engaging with the scriptures to encourage us in spiritual formation. Steve and Emma have been doing some stuff on WhatsApp about Bible engagement, particularly with the Bible app. I've never used the Bible app before this year, and following up on what they've been saying, I've picked up a couple of little short series of studies that have only sort of taken me the time it takes to eat my breakfast to go through. They've been really interesting. One of them has been hugely helpful to me, the other one not so much. I'll tell you how I get along over the months with trying out various ones. And then Rolf has been really enthusiastic for the last year and is now getting round, now finding the time to try and do something about it, to introduce the Bible course. And the Bible course has got the excellent approach of actually looking at the whole of the scriptures. And as Jesus says, the scriptures point to me. Jesus is the one who's the servant king, the risen king, the foretold king, and the shepherd king. But he's the king. You want a bit of theology? How about this? Who's the king of the jungle? Who's the king of the sea? Who's the king of the universe? Who's the king of me? I'll tell you, Jesus is. He's the king for me. He's the king of the universe. the jungle and the sea. Jesus is the King for me. Sure is the King for you as well.